Okay, welcome to First Draft Live. It's Friday, July 25th. I'm your host, Mark Bonner, Bisnow's editor-in-chief, and I'm coming to you live from New York. Thank you. Thank you to so many of you tuning in from across the US and around the world. On today's episode, can the grid keep up, or is the data center surge about to break? AI demand has supercharged leasing and rents, but the infrastructure cannot keep pace, and the cracks are starting to show. Transformers are backlogged, transmission lines are stuck in permitting, and in some markets, developers are waiting up to 5 years. 5 years, Dan, just to plug in. Now, PJM, the country's largest grid operator, is under political fire. And from Phoenix to Northern Virginia, fully funded sites are frozen, tangled in delays, politics, and grid dysfunction. Our guest today, my colleague, Dan Rabb, Bisnow's national data center reporter. Dan's been talking to developers, power providers, and hyperscale tenants for years. And today he's here to help us make sense of the cracks forming in industry's hottest asset class. We'll also get into the capital stack and why data center CRE is starting to look more like infrastructure finance. Very annoying, very interesting development in the last couple of weeks. Also, to the audience, we're taking questions from you today, AMA style. So send them into the chat now, and my producers will get this to me as soon as possible. Dan, welcome to the show. I know you're calling from Boston.
Yeah, thanks for having me on and for the kind introduction. Happy Friday, and excited to be chatting about data centers with you.
Okay, let's jump on in. Nearly 80% of US data center demand is concentrated in just 6 markets, and all of them are power constrained as per your reporting. In PJM, home to Northern Virginia and Ohio, average interconnection wait times now exceed 5 years. Lead times for key components like transformers and switch gears, 18 to 36 months. And what's going on here? What's the latest?
Well, overall in the data center industry, power is the long pole in the tent when it comes to development, the scarcity of power, you might say. It's the biggest challenge that developers are solving for right now, among many, right? It's not, we hear about these waves of demand, and the growth of the industry, but there's labor constraints, severe labor constraints that have slowed growth. There's supply chain constraints. You were mentioning, wait times for transformers. It really is, though, power that is kind of superseding all those things. And just to give you a sense of it, and I don't want to oversimplify things here, but an easy way to think about it is if you turn back the clock just 5 years, 7 years, a data center that had a few dozen megawatts of capacity, 30 megawatts, that was considered a pretty big data center project. Today, we're looking at projects that are a few hundred megawatts, being announced regularly. And so say you're trying to build, it's 5 to 7 years ago, you want to build a 50 megawatt data center in Northern Virginia, the world's largest data center market.
Loudoun County.
Loudoun County. 5 to 7 years ago, you get some land near transmission lines, you get in touch with the utility, they give you a letter saying you'll have power by a certain time. And we're talking probably months, not years, right? And the amount of time varies depending on, whether they need to build a substation, things like that. But you could count on, they said they'll have power to you by a certain date. There's no mystery there. You're going to get power by that date. Fast forward to today, that situation looks really, really different. There's more data centers being built, and the scale of those projects is just way, way bigger. Campuses with multiple data centers that have 50, 60, 70 megawatts each, it's sort of wild to see how it's gone from, there's megawatt scale campuses being built right now. That was something that we wrote an article 2 years ago saying, are we ever going to see a gigawatt data center campus? And now, that's at least planning for those is the new normal. So if you want to build, say, a 500 megawatt data center in Northern Virginia and any of the traditional hotspots, You go to the utility, you say you need 500 megawatts. It's a lot different situation than it was 5 to 7 years ago. First of all, you're one of 50 developers who's asking for that same sort of thing. And the utility, who's legally obligated to fulfill those requests, is looking at this queue of gigawatts of power that people are asking for. It's way, way more than they can possibly fill, right? It's overwhelmed what the grid infrastructure can carry. A transmission line can only carry so much power, right? A power plant can only produce so much power. So now it's not just them building like a substation for you and running a little transmission line to, now
Right.
it's redeveloping an entire transmission corridor, and it's building new power plants. These are things that take, years to do, take billions of dollars to do. So they may, and so now they're saying, well, it's not 6 months, it's 7 years to get power, but also that 7 year timeline is really kind of an estimate, right? You can't really count on that. So the hyperscalers who are driving all this demand, the big tech companies, the Googles, Microsofts, their data center procurement teams who are driving demand here, they have desks full of people saying, hey, we're going to have, 300 megawatts for you at this site in this market by this date, but they don't really trust any of that. And so basically the winners here are going to be the companies that can reliably get power quickly for these
Right.
hyperscalers, if that makes sense.
And this situation has gotten so dire in recent months that it's become political. And now there's real questions nationally about who's actually in charge of the grid in the United States. PJM interconnection, which serves about 65 million people, give or take, is under political fire. 9 governors signed a letter this month accusing PJM of dysfunction and threatening to leave. Meanwhile, FERC, that's the federal regulator in charge of transmission, is also in leadership transition, which has thrown a little bit more chaos into this conversation. Yet PJM at this moment controls nearly 30% of US data center development. Dan, I know you've dug into this tension. Does anyone actually have the power, no pun intended, to speed things up?
Yeah, it's a good question and a timely one. I mean, I guess the where I'd start with this is just the way that our power grid and electric transmission infrastructure is structured in the US is just incredibly labyrinthian and balkanized and multi-layered in a way that makes any sort of broad scale reform very difficult. And just to kind of outline it, you mentioned PJM. PJM is one of 7 kind of regional, they're called RTOs or ISOs, but they're these regional transmission organizations that basically run the grid in sections of the country, separate grids. And within these organizations are the utilities who actually sell power to customers. And let's take PJM as an example. PJM has 1,200 member utilities, right? So over 1,000 member utilities underneath it who all have their own operations and ways of doing things and interactions with customers. You also have each state within, has their own utility commissions and their own laws that regulate power transmission. So that's another sort of actor and complicating factor within that. And then on top of that, you have, sort of the federal regulatory bodies like the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, who sort of oversee all these transmission organizations. So you think about all these different bodies with their own agendas and their own, who all kind of are a different piece of the puzzle, and the amount of stakeholders you have to get on board with any kind of change is really significant. And so it's just not a system that's particularly well suited to making the widespread changes that a lot of people I talk to say are needed right now if we're going to, if the demand from data centers is going to be fulfilled, if that makes sense.
Right. And like in this broadly in commercial real estate, the housing crisis here is a great example of this. There's a whole lot of energy around, and interest rates is another conversation about this, where like things that the industry says it needs yesterday, but then can't come to pass for years ahead. Housing crisis can't be solved in the next 10 years. It's going to take a long time. Interest rates, we're still wait and see mode. We'll see what happens with Powell next week. And then this is another one where even in my own sources that I talked to here in New York at our last data center event, The conversation isn't about can I get the capital to build a data center? The question is, how am I going to get the power to power the data center once I build it? Building it is one thing, powering it is another. So I guess along those lines, Dan, in your opinion, just based on your reporting, what is the best case scenario for a reform timeline as we're looking at the US grid?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's I think there's disagreement about what we're talking about when we talk about reforms and the changes that are needed. There's this the transmission organizations like PJM and utilities are dealing with a pretty difficult situation, right? These are power demand in the United States was pretty much stagnant for decades. These are not organizations that are used to existing in an environment in which there's this surge of growth that they need to somehow fulfill. Um, they're also dealing with this surge in demand while there is a transition um, towards renewable energy, right? Most of the projects that are in what they call the interconnection queue, which is sort of the line waiting to be connected to the grid, are solar, largely solar, also wind, battery projects, things like that as well. And those behave very differently from fossil fuel sources like natural gas, coal, that kind of thing. And so uh, it's been a huge challenge for them to sort of figure out how to ensure reliability of the grid, ensure that costs stay down. And that was even kind of before you added the surge of demand into the picture. So there is a lot of disagreement, though, between, say, the Trump administration, data center developers, activists, or advocates for clean energy about, what not just what reforms are needed, but like what the end goals of those reforms are. Are we just trying to meet demand for data centers? Even if that means, saying, okay, all you solar projects, you wait to the side for years. We're just going to hook
Yeah,
up a lot of natural gas. What are the end goals there? And so there's disagreement even at that level. So, I'm not hearing a lot from folks talking about specific timelines yet. It's almost just trying to get the ball rolling, if that makes sense.
makes perfect sense. And you brought up Donald Trump. Let's talk about it. Earlier this week, Donald Trump unveiled his AI action plan. It explicitly encourages self-powered campuses. Meta is investing in on-site natural gas generation in Ohio and Louisiana. Amazon is exploring modular microgrids. The logic is if utilities can't deliver, then the industry needs to build their own. As you know, more than 6 gigawatts of privately operated generation is already planned or under construction throughout the country, and that number would triple by 2027. Dan, in your reporting on this week, what are your sources telling you about whether or not this workaround could actually become the new normal?
It's a good question. And, it's definitely something we're seeing more of, right? Data centers, really data center campuses being built either with uh, some form of power generation, almost always natural gas, either on the campus or contracted directly with a energy developer, as opposed to going through the grid. Terms behind the meter in in the industry jargon. Um, and we're definitely seeing more of that, right? It's something you really saw none of, a year or two ago, and now is there's a lot of projects being pursued with that sort of thing. As far as whether it becomes the new normal is a different question. It's really easy to see the appeal of it, right? You can't get grid energy. Well, why not just produce our own? Um, a couple of things um, stand in the way of really widespread adoption. And just to name a couple of them, first of all, the large tech companies who are by far the largest data center users they're the tenants who people are trying to bring on, or get powered land so that they will build on that land. They still view utility power as like the gold standard, right? They for cost reasons, really for reliability reasons, they will, at least having heard from a couple of sources at companies like Microsoft, they'll wait a little longer for a project that will give them power from the grid as opposed to getting power from maybe on-site generation or behind the meter natural gas, even if that's a little bit faster. Again, reliability and cost being big reasons there. It's also, while it's easy to think about it as sort of a workaround, these projects also face their own sort of unique constraints. So just as power transmission infrastructure is constrained, right? So too is natural gas infrastructure, right? Like it's not a limitless supply of natural gas flowing through a gas pipeline. So the ability of a particular data center site to have as much gas as it needs to fuel itself, to produce that power all the time is not always so clear, and it's not clear that that will be a limiting factor in how many of these projects get built out. And then the final thing I'd say is a lot of these projects require or basically ask the data center firm to have expertise in an area where they're really not experts. These are companies that have not historically done their own on-site generation or even understood sort of some of the underlying issues. It's a very steep learning curve, and I think a lot of companies are just, for good reason, uncomfortable sort of going outside of their outside of their comfort zone, so to speak.
If you're just tuning in, we're talking with Dan Rabb, Bisnow's national data center reporter, about how the AI gold rush is colliding with a very analog problem. The grid can't keep up. Dan, let's go to some questions from the audience. Microsoft has committed to Helion for power from the first power positive fusion generator. What does the rest of the industry think about this tech? What are your sources telling you?
It's interesting. So fusion, and I will admit, so I'm not overwhelmingly familiar with the specific deal that you're talking about, but I will say fusion in general, I think it's viewed, I'm going to quote somebody from one of our Bisnow data center conferences where they said, fusion is the technology of the future and it always will be. That is just one perspective I've heard, but just basically the sense I get is that there are power issues right now, today, that need to be dealt with. And so there are solutions that are out there, maybe years in the future, that there's a lot of intrigue around and interest in. But the focus is really on things that can have an answer in the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And, I'll extend that out to, we're talking about nuclear, small nuclear reactors, right? There's a ton of buzz around what they call SMRs in the data center sector. These are, a fraction of the size of think more of like the nuclear reactors that power an aircraft carrier than your 3 Mile Island style
Yeah.
nuclear power plant. And there's a bunch of companies trying to bring these SMRs to market. The technology is there. It's making it, it's bringing it to a price point where you can make it marketable and where it can be competitive. So that is something that I've talked about a lot. But in the best case scenario, what I hear is that it's 5 years out before the first of these SMRs are deployed, and the ability to scale it up, to use it in a more widespread way, is 10 years out minimum. So again, a lot of attention paid to these things, but I think it's sort of being pushed to the back of people's minds because there's such an immediate need to address these power concerns.
Right. And that's just another cost concern. And that's another timeline that's way out into the future where there seems to be this mad dash to getting things done now. But at every level of the government and at every level of of finance, right? Case in point, tariffs. The U.S. now has an average effective tariff of 15.5%. Construction materials, servers, power infrastructure, they're all affected. Developers report a 1 million to 1.2 million cost increase per megawatt just from Trump's trade policy. Meanwhile, supply chain volatility continues, lead times are rough, and tariffs on Chinese steel and electrical gear remain in flux. How does that factor into the equation when we're talking about this other issue with the power? And then now you layer on economic policy out of the White House on top of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. In some ways, the power constraints end up being almost a saving grace because if that's your long pole in the tent, then if the supply chain constraints can, they're not pushing project deadlines back just because there's this other factor that is pushing the project deadline back so much. But that said, almost universally, what I've heard from folks in the industry is that the tariff situation does create a meaningful impact and is making an already difficult
Yeah.
supply chain situation a little more difficult to navigate. Uh, most folks recall, during the pandemic, global supply chains got scrambled quite a bit for a variety of reasons. The data center sector has never really come out of that, right? You're still for crucial items, transformers, things like that, down to basic building materials. Um, lead times of a year or more, approaching 2 years. It shifts pretty rapidly, but you're still looking at 2 years for a generator and a transformer and things like that. And the tariff situation has, people were already pursuing really creative solutions to try to make sure that when you get power and and it's go time, let's build, that you
Right.
actually have everything you need on site to get the project done. And certainly tariffs have made that more difficult. It has. I do hear from some folks that there has been the intended impact of the tariffs and a lot of companies looking to onshore some degree of manufacturing, if possible. Um, Obviously the amount of, it takes a long time to do that sort of thing. But it is something that a lot of companies
Right.
up
I
and
mean,
down
and
the
this,
supply chain are looking at.
I mean, there seems to be a lot of shifting dynamics here, right? The Trump administration wants to nearshore, onshore things into the United States, right? But then we have this tariff situation. We have these costs that are going up. It might actually be cheaper to do these things overseas. Does a data center have to be in the United States? Could it be in Asia? Could it be in Europe? Could it be in South America? The Trump administration made a strategic decision to allow NVIDIA to sell its chips to Asia, China directly, right? Are you hearing from your sources that maybe site selection is going to shift more aggressively overseas? Or is this just more negotiation pain via the White House?
So the answer is yes, but it's important not to overstate the case, right? So just by way of background here, a lot of data center site selection has to do with the particular computing workload that is going to be housed inside that data center, right? Like it's the reason why data centers tend to be clustered together in certain markets, right? The term is latency, the amount of time it takes data to flow from the data center to where the end user is and back again. So, and so it's unlikely, for example, that a data center that is being planned for Northern Virginia, which tend to be the most latency sensitive, it's there for a reason. That's not just going to, they're not going to say, oh, it's too expensive to build here. Let's build this in Japan, right? Or South America.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, there are use cases that are more location agnostic, particularly with AI. Certain AI workloads are less latency sensitive. And you can extend that out to, some cloud providers, today have data centers on the East Coast and on the West Coast that serve, you know, some markets for certain types of computing, in Asia Pacific or in Europe, for certain things. And so around the margins there with both of those cases, you could see situations where, look, today it's the United States is by far kind of the cheapest and easiest place to build data centers. If that changes, which maybe tariffs do change that, yeah, like these use cases around the edges could,
Yeah.
shift, but it's around the edges. Like I said, you're not going to see things that were meant for these core markets suddenly going elsewhere. But AI, some of that for sure, possibly.
Let's get another question from the audience. Dan, it was announced this week that there would be support on the federal level for developing data centers of 100 megawatts or larger on federal land. Given the recent pushback in local communities to scale down the size of data center projects in their respective areas, Do you see a bottleneck forming in the push to develop on federal land?
It's a really interesting question. And yeah, there was a just to give a little background here. So there was an executive order signed by President Trump on Wednesday that, among other things, um, it encourages data center development and development of energy infrastructure for data centers on federal land. It should be noted this continues a policy of the Biden administration. President Biden also signed an executive order doing that exact same thing. There are some differences between the two surrounding labor and hiring practices and a few other things, and focus on renewable energy and things like that. But the idea of building on federal land is something that has had bipartisan support behind it.
Dan, when we talk about federal land, what kind of land is this? I mean, this isn't like national parks, is it? I mean, what are we talking about here?
No, it's particularly in the Western U.S. There's a huge amount of federal land, Bureau of Land Management, and I don't want to get too far out over my skis when in terms of what I know about the specific types of parcels they'd be looking. They've I know some of the specific policy documents from both administrations had talked a bit about sites near or adjacent to national laboratories, Idaho National Laboratory, things like that.
Right.
But as far as specific sites on federal land, I don't have a ton of insight into that, unfortunately. I wish I did. But the question of pushback is a really important one. I would say of the challenges facing the industry right now, one of the biggest is the rise of opposition at the local level, right? These, until very recently, these were buildings that were, most people didn't know what they were, right? And they were only built in areas with a lot of industrial things like that. Now, as power gets more scarce, they're increasingly going to wherever they can find power near these major markets. And that means near residential areas or into, more rural communities that aren't used to having somebody build a giant industrial structure there, right? And don't like what that does to their town.
NIMBYism. They don't create a lot of jobs. They don't produce a lot of taxes for the community. Yeah, you've written about this for years, Dan, and that's still ongoing. And it's because a lot of these small communities around the country over the 5 or 6 years have gotten wiser about what data centers are and what they are not. And just because you see a big company like Meta or Google come in, which that could get you excited about, right? It's not exactly what you think it is going to be once the data center is completed. Is that correct?
Yeah, and look, I think it's a very regardless of where one falls on these issues, most people don't want a giant concrete structure built across the street from their house, right? It's an understandable perspective, at least I believe. But you know, uh, there's there's been a growing amount of kind of organized opposition and, like you said, understanding of some of the broader issues, the potential impact on like rising power prices, things like that. There's some stuff that is true, some stuff that maybe there would be a lot of pushback to from a factual perspective, maybe around water use and things like that. But the difference between today and 5 years ago is that pretty much everybody knows what data centers are. Everybody's read stories in their local paper about, the
Right.
person's well stopped producing water because of the data center right there. And the industry, the data center developers have had to adjust to this. They have not been used to having to fight these battles at the local level. And it's been a big change and a big adjustment and a big challenge that they're just sort of getting their heads around right now. And it's only going to be more of an issue going forward. And to answer the listeners' question, in terms of how that impacts federal lands and the move towards that, I mean, I think maybe the idea is that federal lands will have less of an ability, to have that sort of local pushback, right? But I'm not sure. It's something that's very much worth looking into.
Okay, my producer's furiously telling me to wrap it up, but I do want to go to one more question from our audience. So it's kind of an interesting question for a reporter, so feel free to pass on this. But
Good
in
shot.
your reporting, Dan, given the economic and political constraints, are hyperscalers' expectations unrealistic given the moment? What are you hearing?
So expectations in terms of how much they want to build out, like the amount of capacity they want to build.
I'm going to interpret this as the difference between what they can get financed and built versus what can actually come online, right? I mean, we know the demand for data centers is we haven't met the demand yet, right? We're still trying to meet the demand, right? And this is one of the fastest growing things of the last 10 years in the commercial real estate space. I think that's the question, right? Like,
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, actually. I as a journalist, I'm sort of trained to not project or put my own opinions out there. What I hear from folks, I don't hear folks saying this is unrealistic. That it's that the planned capex or whatever they say their uh, runway is for building out their computing capacity. That sort of market conditions and some of these constraints that we've been talking about will not allow that to happen at the pace they want. I think there are serious questions around, when we look at some of these big projections of data center demand that you hear from utilities, X number of gigawatts in the development pipeline, things like that. A lot of that probably won't materialize. A lot of Microsoft, for example, I'm just using them as an example. I'm not saying them specifically, but might plan 3 projects in one market and then only build one, the one that gets power first, right? So some of these pipelines for certain areas probably will not end up being as big as they are. I think there's widespread consensus on that.
okay, that's all the time we have for today. Dan, thanks so much for being here.
That was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
All right, we'll be back with another episode of First Draft Live next week, so don't miss out. You can sign up now on our event page. You can also find today's episode and all of our past conversations on your favorite podcast app. I'm partial to Spotify, Dan. You can also check us out on bisnow.com. This is First Draft Live. Have a great weekend, everyone.